US politicians are trying to pass this law, the Antisemitism Awareness Act, which changes the
Please go watch the rest of his video because he is entirely correct, and we should all be very concerned about the possible federal censorship of any kind of criticism of Zionist ideology and the state of Israel. However, I just wanted to stitch this because this has going to have like dire effects in academia that I think a lot of us are not aware of. So I go to the University of Denver, and we are having so many issues right now. One of the issues that we have continuously had is the issue of freedom of expression, um, because we have a very open freedom of expression, freedom of like academic freedom policy, which is good in some cases, but horrendous in others because it basically allows professors to say whatever racist shit, homophobic, transphobic shit they want, with no consequences whatsoever. And that's part of why students don't want to go here anymore. Um, but we have an annual kind of like conference slash thing that we do every year, called the Spark Freedom of Expression Panel. It's like a day-long event, and they talk about different areas that have come up of like issues with the freedom of expression policy. And there's like a mixture of students, staff, faculty that talk at it. I didn't go to the one this year because of I was at a field trip for my one of my courses. But last year, which was the first year that they did it, they had a very it was very interesting, because one of my professors who deals with Middle Eastern history, specifically the history of Jews in the Middle East. He's an amazing professor. I love him so much. He's actually the secondary reader for my distinction thesis. And one of the things that he brought up during the panel was that our shifting definition of anti Semitism, our shifting legal policies with Israel could mean that all of his classes are illegal and he and all of his students would be subject to search by the CIA. And could we please talk about it? And everybody collectively said no. And so we never did. But that's something that I've thought about because for the entire rest of the year, he had to shut down his classes and could not teach, um, anything at all for fear that he and his students would be subject to searches by the CIA. So yeah, I just wanted to point out that, we're talking about how this is going to shut down freedom of speech and it's going to try and shut down and make illegal these protests that are happening, which we already are seeing, like a violation of like everybody's First Amendment rights for protesting, on these campuses, not just in this case, but in other cases as well, which of course I can always get back to like the shit happening at the University of Denver. But it also is just going to have like dire repercussions of like what we can study, what kind of history can be taught, because it's going to push a very specific narrative. Like this will drastically affect, Middle Eastern studies, history classes, poli sci, international studies, public policy. It's going to greatly restrict what can and cannot be taught, because of honestly of ironic hypocrisy of, we ask a lot of, Jews will come up and ask me like, hey, don't conflate Jews with the state of Israel, don't conflate Jews with Zionism. And then we ask that, hey, Zionism is anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. Um, which is interesting because we always say like, why do you specifically care about Israel when other countries do war crimes too? And it's like other people, we do care about when other countries commit war crimes. But why are you so bothered when this other country, which has been its own separate country for 75 years, is committing war crimes? And so I think it's really interesting that they use this narrative that we are only harping on Israel. Like I've seen so many people being like, well, if you truly care about Muslims, if you truly care about it, like, Arabs, why didn't you do anything when, like the hijabi police were executing people in Iran? And it's like, first of all, Iranians are not Persian, are not, Arab. They're Persian. A lot of them are, at least. Second of all, we did care. We were, spreading that information everywhere, trying to raise money, trying to raise awareness, trying to get sanctions for Iran as well. Same thing like things are happening in Sudan. At least all the protests that have happened at the University of Denver have recognized what's happening in Sudan, have recognized what's happening in Congo. And so there's this really false narrative happening that we only care when Israel messes up, when Israel commits war crimes because we want a reason to demonize Jews, and that's just not true. But they're using this narrative to conflate that criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic because we're only criticizing Israel and nothing else, when that is just blatantly false. Um, Same thing, they're trying to conflate that like Zionism is part of Judaism because of the long history of like wanting to go back to Israel. However, I would argue that this is like a long distance nationalism back to 3,000 years ago Israel, not current Israel, because Israel has existed and yet Jews choose not to go there. Even now, Jews are choosing not to move there, which is once again a really interesting phenomenon. But also the fact that like a good portion of Zionists are Christian, I think positions it more as a political ideology rather than a facet of Judaism. Um, but that's just me. But anyway, it's like they're using these narratives that are not true in order to push this thing um, in for some reason that I don't truly understand. But it's terrifying to watch as a Jewish individual, like a portion of my communities just delve into fascism with the policing of language, with the policing of history and academia, um, and the use of false narratives in order to demonize. Like the fact that the Hillel on my campus has brought in speakers to say, by the way, taking hostages is part of Muslim culture is so problematic because it does. And they're also creating this narrative that like all Zionist counter protests have been peaceful, that all Zionists have been peaceful, when it's like I can see the people reposting calling for an act of genocide in Gaza, that we should just raise the whole area because only Jews can do something beautiful to it. And, there's just full of verminous bacteria, which are actual things I have heard people say. Um, it's horrifying, and it's absolutely horrifying that like they're using a legitimate issue to either push this narrative and push this agenda because anti-Semitism is rising. However, we're not looking at actual cases of anti-Semitism anymore. We're looking at cases of dissent from Zionism or dissent of Israel, which, if we did actually value freedom of speech and freedom of protest and the First Amendment, we would allow and we would make safe spaces for discourse. However, because there is so much legal pushback and like institutional pushback from these college campuses and from state government and from federal government, we go to protest because we're not being heard. And I think that's something that people also don't realize. And I've had to explain time and time again to our administration at DU is that protesting is almost never the first option people choose. People choose to protest when they don't feel like their voice is being heard. And that's an institutional problem that you should solve rather than being like, oh, these students are just crazy and they want to cause violence. And it's like, that's usually never actually the case. Like, we want to graduate, we want to have a college experience, we want to enjoy being here. However, it's like you've made an environment where we don't feel valued, where our voices don't feel valued, and so we choose to do something that will raise awareness to it. And instead of being like, hey, how can we fix our system? We're like, oh no, these kids are the problem. Um, because they're costing us money and they're making us look bad and they're showing issues that we have that we don't want people to know they have. Um, which is ultimately the thing with DU and probably a lot of other universities as well. Granted, DU is handling our protests a lot better, I think, than most other universities, as they have promised that they will not call the police on us, and have proven in the past that when DPD has shown up to protest, they're like, hey, you're not supposed to be here, like, no one called you, please go away. Um, but, which is nice. However, it's like they're still taking these steps to still side with this narrative that we're inherently in the wrong. And I have videos of these protests, these pro-Palestine protests, and Jews are not mentioned once, Judaism is not mentioned once, never once is Zionism or Israel conflated with Judaism. However, that is still the narrative that is being pushed despite no evidence being there that this is happening.